Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is the first of a series of public events by the Service Futures Lab here at London College of Communication. And as they're announced, we're going to send out announcements on our newsletter. So I'll share the link later on for the newsletter, but please sign up if you want to be kept updated. So it's my absolute pleasure to have Alison Prendiville here to deliver the first of these lectures. Alison is a service designer. She works very much with technology, with health, and very much at the intersection between many different design disciplines. And what is really amazing about Alison is that she has completely started service design here at LCC. She is, incredibly influential worldwide within the field of service design. So I'm really happy that we finally convinced her to give this lecture publicly. Alison's approach is very much coming from both a design anthropology and a practice research perspective, I think, and systemic perspective as well. So I'll leave you with Alison.
Okay. So thank you very much for attending. It's very nice to see my students here who have already seen this lecture. So I'm assuming either you didn't understand it the first time or you enjoyed it so much the first time you've come back for more. I don't know. But anyway, it's good to see you all here. You will see actually parts of the lecture that I gave before, and for those of you who are unfamiliar, one of the things I have been really struggling with is actually piecing together a sort of history of service design. Often the conversation starts around a service economy as if this is something that's really emerged really since the 1970s, and it has in one sense in the way that it's economically spoken about. However, the history of services goes back much further than that. And for that reason, when I was putting this lecture together, I actually thought that really, for me, there were four parts that were emerging. There is this historical framing. And again, this is very much how I'm piecing together a way in which we see service worlds. And many of them have some very savage histories from the Industrial Revolution, which I will touch upon. And they have consequences today also for sustainability in the way that we see systems. So I'm also going to then look at the nature of service, what do we mean by that, and that has been written about. And also then service design's acceptance and maturity, and that's a relatively recent phenomena. I mean, and really since we started the course, which was 2008, service design practice was emerging from 2000, and it was emerging across Europe. In the UK, very much from a consultancy perspective. In Germany, it was also moving from a consultancy practice, but actually within the Nordic countries, it was very much within the area of a social design, with being responsive to change in the workplace and technology. And then also we have Ezio Manzini, who was driving it from an Italian perspective. And they're all slightly different in the way that actually service design was understood and practiced. So now we are at a point where we've had this maturity and acceptance. And I'm going to give the last part will give some examples of my own service design research and practice, and actually how the anthropology comes in to my thinking when I'm working with diverse teams. So one of the things we tend to think about is that there was the arrival of a goods economy with the Industrial Revolution. And this really, I select Josiah Wedgwood as a sort of British innovator who, with his pottery production in Burleston, really began to innovate. And one of the things he wanted to do was make sure that actually he could sell more pots. That was his business. But how could he do that when the current systems in place meant that he was limited in the channels that he could sell his goods? That was markets. The products were made, they would end up in the markets, they would often get damaged. If they weren't sold, they were returned back to the factory. So really his idea was, how do I scale up? And his idea was that actually if he brought in the use of catalogues, that people could go out across the country with his Wedgwood catalogues and they could order and choose items and then this would come back to the factory, and he would make pots which people had ordered. But of course he had to make sure that the pictures in the catalogues were actually going to be made to the same specification that people had ordered. So there's a challenge. So again, he divided the labor in the factory to start standardizing certain production elements, whether it was the handles or the spouts, to get uniformity. But with all of this, you still have to move these goods. So although he was successful in innovating around glazes, but also in the production techniques, he realized that actually then there was an infrastructural problem, that he needed to move the goods across the country in a way that actually it would be efficient, and that also they would arrive in a condition that actually shops and customers would be satisfied with. So what we're seeing here is a lot of personal investment, money being raised through money that was coming in through the Industrial Revolution, and he was responsible really for producing a canal system to support his production, his manufacturing. And you'll see this in other examples, with whether it's Henry Ford and the car manufacturing, buying up other infrastructure in order to support the supply chain. And again, this was a time of huge knowledge and curiosity about the world. And I just make this connection because with the money that was being generated through the potteries, Charles Darwin was in fact the grandson of Josiah Wedgwood. I don't know how many of you were familiar with that. So when it came to actually investing in scientific exploration, the money from Wedgwood funded the Beagle trip for Charles Darwin. As I said, he was the grandson, and there was this, again, appetite for knowledge. And what's so significant is that we see the book, The Origin of Species, which really celebrates diversity, and diversity in terms of his work on the Galapagos Islands and the way he was recording. But actually, at the same time, what we see are infrastructures and systems which really have contributed to our current position, which is very unsustainable practices, and also plantations, which I'm going to mention in a few minutes. So we have this focus on diversity and just the richness of it. At the same time, we have a production system which is not only greedy, it is savage. So when we look at where this money, this capital was coming into the Industrial Revolution, it was really being supported by the slave trade. And if you have read Eric Williams's book, which was published very early in 1944, it's been recently republished and there are copies available. He actually shows this, what is known as a triangular trade. And what it meant is that the ships that were leaving the British ports of Liverpool, Bristol and Glasgow were never empty. They would take British manufactured goods, they would take them to the west coast of Africa, where they then, as Eric Williams says, they would be traded for human merchandise. The human merchandise went to the Caribbean, where it was traded for sugar. And sugar then would come back to Britain, and this was actually, again, one of the most desirable products. It was the thing that drove, again, taste. It's a very problematic product. And in fact, he says the other aspect of this is this trade was that with colonialism, it actually didn't allow for any other country to nurture their own trade. So at the same time, you have this huge curiosity for science. Again, this was very much driven by desires for power, whether it was, for example, with creating time systems and navigation systems, weights and measures in France. But these systems that we take very much for granted today have some very, as I said, inglorious roots. And I think it's not a very big book, but it's also a very remarkable book, because what it also shows is that the abolition of slavery, which is often presented as really driven by a lot of enlightened individuals, was in fact, its abolition was driven by an economic imperative. In other words, it no longer became economically viable to have slaves on the plantations. And I want you to hold those ideas, because it is about these large and often cruel systems. Because not only did the plantations, again, dehumanize people, they also destroyed much of the environment. The idea of these monocultures with sugar, but it's the same now with soya, they really are, they reduce genetic diversity. And if you look at the anthropology of sustainability, Anna Singh says, together these have moved more soil than the glaciers did and changed the Earth's climate. They have done this by allowing investors to engineer large-scale projects across long distances, converting places to plantations. And actually, again, this is something that, you know, we haven't given up these approaches. They are very much part of our large and systemic world that we deal with every day. If you were to take the mobile phone, probably you would find supply chains which, again, are based on models of plantations extraction. So when we take a simple product like sugar, its history is actually it's eye-opening, and it's also quite savage. So these incidental things that we take for every day, it's always worth trying to question. And there's also, one could include the banana as well, to, in fact, if you were to look in most of our diet and where it's coming, and also our goods generally, you will find that there are some very unpleasant supply chain and histories behind them. So how do I get from Eric Williams to, again, services and healthcare? So if we take, for example, this book by Paul Farmer, Fevers, Feuds and Diamonds, and it's really a book around how the Ebola crisis in 2014 was dealt with and how badly it was dealt with. And the thing with Paul Farmer is he has looked to the work of Sidney Mintz, who actually, again, is an anthropologist who looks not just at an interpretive approach in terms of the contemporary, but he also looks at the historical background in terms of large-scale social and economic structures that actually cause affliction and harm to people, which are very embedded. And he came up with this term structural violence. And structural violence is not direct violence. It's structural in as much as it will mean that you don't have access to healthcare. It will mean that your life is reduced in terms of your achievements. It will mean that, for example, there will be your country is very likely to be loaded with debt, or if investment is given, it will be determined on how much privatization you're prepared to allow to so that the banks have some collateral. So these Paul Farmer presents as structures of violence, but in fact these are very the origins of this comes from Sidney Mintz's work. And when he looks at Ebola, he just shows his history of the west coast of Africa, of Sierra Leone and Liberia, and how this colonial idea of not providing healthcare but containment, and that's what actually drove the West's approach to Ebola. And he examines the way it was presented in the press, in the way that, you know, nobody wanted Ebola escaping from this region. So, and this actually also then impacted on the way that NGOs behaved, and the fallout of this, the disease was devastating for the healthcare practitioners who were there. And when the book is very large, but he traces all these decisions to this very rich history of how colonial powers have embedded particular ideas about what healthcare should be in these countries. And they are also healthcare deserts. So when we're thinking about service, whether it's a healthcare service or whether actually we take the historical in terms of forms of service today, whether it's domestic service or service that we encounter in our everyday lives, we actually do find that there are, again, some recurring issues. There's always this distinction between the served and those being doing the servicing. It's often based on gender and race. There's always, in the case of the 19th century, there was a separation between the downstairs and the upstairs, and also limited freedom and rights. And what you find here is that, in fact, prior to really the mid-19th century, most domestic servants wore clothes which were cheaper equivalents, or they were more everyday clothes to their masters. But as the Industrial Revolution created more and more cheaper cottons and fabrics that imitated wealthier fabrics, they actually didn't like the fact that the upper classes didn't like the fact that they potentially were being copied in the house with their servants. So the idea of uniforms being introduced was to create this distinction, a very clear distinction, between those being served and those doing the serving. So again, we can see how, these service cultures play out. And again, if you were in domestic service, you had to seek permission from your employer. If you wanted to get married, your life was very limited in terms of how many days or visiting family. Again, women it was very difficult for them to have relationships. And often, if there were relationships and they weren't of approval, women would easily lose their jobs. It was a very controlled environment. And let's look at the forms of service today. And what do we find? Well, we don't have the Wedgwoods who are doing the big infrastructure investments. But what we do have is a business model that actually puts the costs completely on the employee. So previously, you'd have Wedgwood going to the banks and investing, raising money and huge personal investment. Whereas now what we have is people taking the risks in terms of how they move around the city, how they protect themselves, whether they have insurance. They also take the risk in terms of having to respond in terms of time and reviews. And they take the risk in terms of managing their time. The inequality issues with what we'd call the platform economy or the gig economy are huge. And the fact that these models are increasingly being presented to us just as normal, and they are not. We really have to question the well-being of people doing these jobs. We have to question who they are, what their status is in society, and actually, are these business models really doing any favors, really, for making a better community and a better society? And they are class, race, and gender issues. So still playing out today when we see people doing their Deliveroo or jobs. So that's the start. That was part one, just to give some background. And as I've said, it's been pieced together by various bits of history and books, mainly from anthropology and design history. But we then have to get onto the nature of service. And again, this is quite a recent article. And it's 2018, and Mizo Kim has written, questioning again, looking at the history of service. And she touches on the fact that service came through the Romans, and that the word service, its origins is from Latin, servitus, which is slavery, and then servitum, which means slave. So again, this connection in terms of service and service history has not got the most auspicious origins. But what she does show is that there's a collective action in a service, and it's about being part of a whole. So it's not about individuals working independently. It is being part of a system, and these can take many different forms. And she takes the example of monastic living, which actually is a service. It's a service to God, but it's a service in terms of how you engage in the environment and with your fellow human beings in this community. So she really looks at the sort of service relationships and these different ways that we negotiate these. So one of the big jumps now is that when we think about services in their modern sense, is that they have, we're very reliant on data. So prior to the arrival of the computer, Services, very much, we talk about domestic service, and there were relationships between people who were being served and those servicing them. But of course, it was more tenuous. With the arrival now with data management, really from the 1950s, but 60s in particular, you're having a very different type of economy. You're having one which is much more relational. It's also a different way of conceiving economic value. And it's also, there's a big emphasis about understanding your customers. It's very much being driven from service marketing and service management. So in this sense of service design coming from design, it really is driven by business models and economic thinking. And in fact, this picture here is just an example of, again, one of the sort of key significant change in an organization when American Airlines introduced the IBM Sabre terminals, which is still the sort of backbone of many airline industries. You know, airlines in themselves, air travel is a service, but actually this system behind it is also a service to the airline industry. And what it allowed people to do was all this booking mechanisms. It allowed you also to build up data on the profiles of the people flying. So we get to a point really from the 1970s where service management, there is this sort of questioning, well, we've got this goods economy, we've got manufacturing. So how do we think about services? And this is really where we start sort of seeing the beginnings of this type of language that we're very familiar with within service design. So in the 1970s, we have a very significant woman in service marketing, Lynn Shostak, who talks about intangibility and this non-material, indistinct nature. We also have people writing about services in the 1980s about in opposition to goods. And there's a very sort of key acronym, which is the IHIP definition of services. And this opposition is that you cannot have inseparability between the user and the service. There's always got to be some interaction. Also, services have heterogeneity about them. In other words, that they're very dependent on all sorts of the individual, but also you'll probably never quite have the same experience twice, although they do try that now with more standardization. The intangibility is that you don't take anything away with you, and there is this perishability. In other words, an example is that you, if you're flying a plane, if that seat is not filled, it is gone. There is no way that you can reduce, you can manage the supply side with pricing, but once that place takes off, the good has gone, or the service has gone. And then we had the Nordic school in the 1990s, and they focused very much on a change of thinking about this is participation. It's about customers as co-producers and actually seeing services much more as open processes. So this is really getting much more into the area of design and thinking about interaction and actually how people might engage with these forms. This other thing with the open processes is that there was this realization with the goods, you have the processes are inside the good. With a service, you're actually encountering the processes as you use the service. So this thinking, although it's useful because it starts us thinking about the different ways that we can think about service design, and actually, are we working in terms of the interaction, the interface, or are we working on something much more complex? And again, this is Lynn Shostak, and this is a very significant development, but she was the first person who came up with the idea of the service blueprint. And the service blueprint was a way in which you could visualize all the front office and back office elements. And this was a way for people to comprehend and to get their head around what is actually a service. So again, this service design has really adopted this from service management, and this is now, it's often seen as one of those key tools within the service design portfolio of methods and tools. Her other important contribution was that she also really got organizations to start thinking about the user, human-centeredness, customer experience, this idea of the back office supporting the front office, and actually how you manage that. It's almost going into the language of performance, almost as a theatre type approach. So this was very, very radical, and it's helped service design think too in terms of, again, conceptualizing what it's about. I'm not a fan of service dominant logic, but I feel I have to mention it. But again, this is very much from service management, and it really sees service as being central to value creation. But it doesn't put so much the user prominently. What it is really focusing on the idea of it's very resource orientated. Now, actually for implementation, that's very important. It's asking, you know, as an organization, do you have the person power and willingness to deliver? Do you have the economic resources? So it's very much from, you know, service dominant logic is very useful. It's just, it's not something that has been very, it's not a theory that I have adopted very much in my own work. And but there are some useful elements, especially this value in exchange, and these, you know, mutually satisfying interactive processes. So we then come on to, we think about data. And one of the things that always strikes me again is that how much of our service world is directed by digital infrastructure, increasingly so. You often find that, you know, people are presenting apps to you. But again, one has to question where, you know, how socially just is this? Who really, again, controls these huge infrastructures, and who are they representing? And I think this is just useful that when you look at the number of data centers worldwide, you can actually see that the US, again, dominates. There are, of course, certain countries that are missing off this list for various reasons in terms of transparency, but actually it's a very Northern Hemisphere focused distribution. Similarly with Google, and this map in the middle is about the servers that Google has 35 spread across 10 countries. Some are in development, some are already up and running. But what is noticeable again is how they are distributed, and how large areas of the globe are just not, they don't feature in locations. Now there may be, of course, climate reasons for that, but actually at the same time, it's probably more to do in terms of, again, certain mindsets about power, knowledge, again, value. And I think one of the books that I am revisited, and again, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with this, if you really want a very good explanation on this cost of connection, from everything from the colonialism, data colonialism that is going on through large companies, but also actually how every aspect of our life is potentially being capitalized through data. It presents a very worrying picture, and actually raises really serious questions about how much, again, how much diversity will we have in the future in all sorts of different forms, whether it's in terms of our own agency, but also in terms of, you know, innovation, when you have these absolute behemoths controlling so much, and, you know, being more powerful, as they so confidently say, than many countries. And it's a fantastic book because it's very, very sort of readable, and I've got lots of very good examples. And when we think about sort of this, you know, these apps and these systems, again, you know, we can be so blind to them in terms of, you know, we carry our phones around in our pocket, and people order things on Amazon. But behind this, there is, again, massive infrastructure which actually we don't we don't experience, again, necessarily the environmental consequences of what we're doing when we're clicking. And last March, when the Ever Given got stuck in the Suez Canal, I mean, the thing that struck me was the fact that this 400-meter ship had 25 crew members. I mean, in terms of its scale, and just, again, reducing the labor costs down to a minimum. And then also when, and it would be interesting to know when it's finally unpicked, you know, who's responsible, and even trying to locate where the boat was registered under multiple companies was, again, a completely, it was a system of complexity that even, you know, John Lanchester was saying is very, very cryptic and difficult to unpick. And it's the physical equivalent of the internet. And this was filled with stuff. And it was also filled with, which is very depressing, sand, which I don't know if any of you are aware of. It's the most mined substance on the planet. And there are some really good books talking about how the beaches in the world are disappearing because sand is being extracted for construction on a massive scale, which is totally unsustainable. So when you see coastal erosion, ask yourself, where is it going? So this ship was filled with trainers, widgets, and lots of sand. And again, it's pursuing this idea, you make stuff where it is cheapest. And these are systems, they're part of the flow of capital, but it's quite interesting when you think of the sort of stuff coming into Amazon warehouses. This is all part of that supply chain. And another thing, so we all think about systems and nested systems, and of course this is about speed, convenience, and efficiency. You know, it is more manageable if you shove it in a box, let's be honest. You know, I was looking through some pictures for this lecture of the old Docklands, and, you know, it was great to see an elephant being lifted off a ship from 100 years ago. And of course, the dockyards were filled with men who took days to empty a ship, whereas actually it can be done in hours. And the fact that these are interconnecting systems between truck to train. So again, you arrive in the port. And so containers get rid of labor and replace it with automation. So with automation though, so of the number of containers coming into Antwerp at the moment, only 2% get surveyed, checked. So there has been a huge problem with this these super ports with, do you know what it could be? Do you know what the problem is? Drugs. So one of the problems is that the gang running the drug supply chain are very efficient. So they infiltrate the employer networks and they recruit people in the ports, and they either threaten them that they have to comply to not check the containers, or and they threaten their families, or they bribe them with large amounts of money to do it. So either way, they're sort of trapped. So now with AI, what they're planning to do is introduce super fast checking, so it won't be just 2% of containers. And there again, so in terms of these nested systems, in terms of societal problems, huge super ports, the way transportation and goods are managed, you know, the scalability that everybody is after has lots of knock-on effects. So again, one looks at that, but actually there is also this dimension about crime coming into Europe through Antwerp, through these very complicated systems. So now we're on part 3, and this is just looking at definition of service design. So it is the intentional activity of planning, organization, relationships between people, institutions, artifacts, and technology. And this is from Daniela Sangiorgi and Anna Moroni in their very important book on service design in 2011. And in a way, service design is all about that configuration, and whether you do it on different levels. So do you do it as an interface, or do you do it at a structural level, or do you do it through networks? And that again leads to whether you're just doing, as I said, maybe changing an interface, or are you coming up with a new service, or are you doing something more transformative? And when, this is familiar to my students, but for those who aren't familiar less familiar with service design, this again can help you think about, again, what type of collaborations you should be having, and also what's really manageable within a project. Lucy Kimball's work is very seminal in terms of identifying what is this object of service design, and she uses 3 lenses with Jeanette Blomberg, who's an amazing anthropologist from America, and they've written this chapter in the book. And you can actually look at the way that you configure your service design contribution can be configured around this triangle. So the service encounter, which is very much, in a way, what I'd call the practices. It's really just, you could then look at the design, and you would look at business management. However, if you're looking at value co-creating system, the value co-creating systems, you'd use the business management, which might be service dominant logic, but you would also look at social sciences, because social science looks at things like structures and networks and practices. And then if you're going for this more socio-material configuration, which I think is where my own work sits, which is very much taking a more systemic view, you would actually look at the social science, especially anthropology, but you look at creative design and technology and how those relationships are formed and at what level. So again, it's worth again looking at some of the theoretical understandings of how we can use service design in these different ways. And then one thing that, again, has emerged really in the last 10 years is this emergence and acceptance, which I mentioned earlier. So when we started the course, 2008, there was this real gap where our students used to say, how do I tell people what I do? How do I convince them that they need a service designer? That's really has changed in a very relatively short time. And one of the sort of significant moments is when you got things like in 2013, the All-Party Parliamentary Design and Innovation Group compiled this report, and it was about restarting Britain. And it was all about how design could help local government deliver services more effectively, more collaboratively, not just seeing users as people who are done to, but who are active and involved in a dialogue. And this really was a reflection in terms of a change in politics, which had started also really at the end of the 90s, where, for example, the language was much more new public management mode, which was all about customers. And whereas with New Labour, they started a new public governance approach, which was much more about citizens being collaborators between active participants. So there's, again, change of mindset politically before you start really seeing how this has played out also within local government. And we did quite a lot of work with different local government partners. We still do, but it's sort of easier now. You don't spend most of your time trying to convince them about the value of what the work will be about. There's more understanding. But, again, Daniela and Anna talk about how there are all these different terms being used in local government, service design, strategic design, macro design, public sector or third sector design, design thinking, human-centered design. Design thinking really probably has had its day. It's considered to be quite, it's no offense if anybody's doing design thinking, I don't want to, but, it's still, I think it's useful for people who are less familiar with design practice and those maybe embedded in cultures which really are quite removed from these collaborative ways of working. But I would say really that social design is probably where I sit, rather than social design, service design. And I have worked through my research with the public sector, and I, to be honest, I don't get so hung up by these different terms, but some people do feel that they're more critical. I think the most important thing is actually about the approaches and the methods. I think the idea is that there is a whole toolkit that you can have easy access to. However, I'm very mindful these days is that you can overuse these, that we would encourage people to actually find their own ways of collaborating and developing tools that are particularly responsive and situated within the variety of contexts that you're expected to work in. And we've always encouraged that. So yes, there are these lots of how to do service design books, but I think actually we've got to be increasingly critical of how these off-the-shelf approaches do not always deliver what they're promising to do. And this is just some reflections about service design in local government with some projects I did a few years ago with students, but it was also part of a research project. And how are we using co-design in these in this work? So there was definitely co-designing new service possibilities, and that was really taking people within the organisation on a journey in which they had to rethink what their futures might be in terms of the current service. And it was actually a journey which was very collaborative, and although it was about new ideas, new ways of working, it was also about building a dialogue about the new possibilities and trust, because the trust had broken down within the organisation. Co-designing for new end users. So again, this was for the Home Library project on how these elderly people who currently received books being delivered at home, this service could amplify value which was already implicit, but how could we amplify that with them into services that might actually add new forms of value in terms of company, understanding their interests, etc., and being less isolated at home. We also then did co-designing for new organisational structures and changing mindsets, and that was with the council employees. And that was again a completely different level. So we're going constantly from the we're looking at the people within the council. We're looking at the people using the service. We're going back into the council and looking at people from different departments. And then, and this was the real challenge, was how could we co-design for new external relationships that were needed in order to make this new service possible. So there's a whole configuration there, which is totally relational, all reliant on co-design, very much within the service design's way of working. And then we have this service design in transforming public services. So that the project I've just shown was at Camden Council, but again, this maturity that's coming through the field, where again, government departments, agents are all promoting service design and in a way for it to be a vehicle for transforming local public services. Unfortunately, much of this is about bringing down costs. Some of it is about reshaping services, providing new data streams is always valuable, and managing demands. But there is a lot of criticism that this is also part of a bigger neoliberal agenda in which actually government shrinks and digital services take over as a replacement. So none of it is what I'd call, say, we can celebrate service design, but we have to be, again, very cautious over what ends we're using it for. And I guess one of the things, it's much more than touch points. And in fact, there is a journal called Touch Points. So we'll leave it at that. But what we're really trying to do in service design is much more about these relationships with human to human, human to non-human, but also actually we're now looking at more than human in terms of our relationships with species, living systems. And we really do focus on this need to address social inequalities, climate change. It's always an ongoing process, and that's why, although I'm Professor of Service Design, Sylvia is more accurately the reader for Designing for Service, which actually is really the title that should be presented, because a service is ongoing. There is not a point where you cut off and say it's done. So, as I've said, we're moving towards planetary centered or to more understanding living systems. And perfect timing, Delina. Say your name on the bottom. That couldn't have been. I had the pleasure of working with Delina and also another postdoc, Chimithri. And through our work in India, it really made us reflect on, again, what our roles were in service design in the global south, and also questioning this, questioning outsiders coming into environments which you are unfamiliar, but you also then have to work with new partners and new stakeholders. And one of the things we were questioning is about accounting for ourselves. And too often service designers do go in with the idea that this can be quick fixes. Actually, it's very rare there is a quick fix. Really so much of it is about understanding, listening, hearing the stories, the lives as lived, especially when it's of sensitive issues in healthcare, or even actually where we've worked in farming. People are very precious, quite rightly so, about how they live. They don't want to be judged. They don't, what outsiders see as the problems are not often the same priorities or problems that the people who are on the farms or in the community see. So you have to be very culturally sensitive and specific. And we created a set of tools, which is now in the Routledge Design Methods book, where actually, and we will make these available actually on the Service Design Futures Lab. Yes, website, sorry. What did I say? Oh, website, yes, Service Design Futures website. So that actually, if anybody wants to just have a look at them and play around with them, they will be available. And one of the things I'm quite interested in is service worlds within the human condition, and that's really, again, links with the anthropology. And I use this very much as a way of trying to understand and see the world. And that goes back to the work with people like Paul Farmer. And the idea is that, there are these systems and structures in place. Very much what we do is, it's what it is to be human. The digital, although it seems to be exciting and new, very much our practices played out in a different way, but the same practices played out in a non-digital world as they do under a digital world. It might just be faster and a greater volume, and it's being aware of those connections. So I think also there's for me, this idea of the cultural dimensions and the very specific contextual nature of services is really critical. I work very much on a place-based approach. I think also that most places are very fragile and temporal. We've seen that in the way that when you go into communities, you see the way that the relationships are making a place. You see it through the actions, the things that are shared, the way that even the materiality of a place that is constructed. But these things are very, very fragile. So in a way, for our role as service designers to understand that making of place and those values, and it's actually to amplify those in a way that maybe can make them more visible, or can actually, with the participation of the community and with their own agency, allow them to flourish. So again, this was a temple that was on a poultry farm that I visited in southern India, and there were sheds of chickens, but the owner, because he felt that he was successful, he felt that with the money from his business, it was important for him to build a temple that actually the people in the community and on his farm could use as a celebration of actually his good fortune. So again, I've been in many labs where outside there are statues of deities, and the idea that, you know, in the West we have this separation between science and our spiritual beliefs. Again, it's understanding this much greater entanglement that one often sees in the field, and you can choose to ignore, but it's best not to, because it's actually quite fundamental. And I think, again, this goes on to these different forms of knowledge. So this picture is from a primary healthcare centre in Assam. And what's interesting, despite the words being in English, that it has a herbal garden. And, you know, when you go into communities around a healthcare issue, and the one that we were looking at is urinary tract infections, it wasn't appropriate to go and ask about UTI as outsiders. We used our partners who we've worked very, very closely with, and they've been absolutely, you know, we're, in terms of our the project with many partners, its success is because of the relationship we have with our colleagues in Assam. But the first thing actually was not really about UTI, it is what does it mean to be well? And I think when you're looking at communities, you have to ask again, what does a place play in community health? So natural remedies. This, in a primary healthcare centre, was actually very fundamental in the way that actually the women manage the symptoms of UTI. It's cost effective, it's there, it's local knowledge, and again, how do we amplify that? You know, who are the key actors who have that knowledge? We've been very lucky working with ASHES, the accredited social health activists who have trusted members of the community. And again, what are the belief systems around health? And what we have developed, and I'm not showing it for this presentation, is a very, very simple community-based test, which has been developed with Edinburgh, but we have built the service around that with our partners in India and the community to, again, amplify local knowledge about managing symptoms, visualizing what the symptoms are so that women can build their own knowledge about and give them some agency. And I haven't got the examples of it, but again, we've worked very much within a very culturally specific and sensitive way in the project. And again, cultivating culture in health. This was, again, one of the co-design sessions. We were working with Chandri here, and again, with these are all ASHES, giving their input about the symptoms that people have, how do they discuss them, again, who are the people who do they go to in the community. So when you're looking at cultivating culture in health, I mean, David Napier, who's an anthropologist at UCL, has made some really key points that actually building trust in healthcare is one of the things. If you think of even COVID and the way that there were resistances around the vaccine, all of that was to do with trust. So we'll find lots of examples in highly modern healthcare systems where the trust has broken down, increasingly so. So again, trust is a cultural value that needs to be nurtured, that actually you need to align any practices with local cultural meaning. And when we look at our community-based test, we have really aligned it with the idea that it reinforces notions around natural remedies, prevention, and actually we certainly haven't gone in with technology that we would put in a primary healthcare centre, would break down very little electricity or patchy electricity, and that would be redundant very quickly. And also, what does agency in healthcare look like? Oh, I don't know how to get rid of that. Do I need to tap something? Oh, sorry. Thank you. And then also, okay, right, nearly done. So, and also, and this almost goes back to almost the origin of species. The more globalized we become, the more we're going to lose cultural diversity in healthcare. And actually, that is not going to serve communities well. We really do need to understand, again, you know, how people have their own care practices and how those can be, again, amplified in order to create care cultures and well-being. So this is really coming to the end. I think, you know, in our own work, it's about meaningful healthcare narratives that need to be created through the service design practice with the communities, with your partners. We're constantly shifting again, you know, between mindsets of, again, what a diagnostic should be. We've completely changed that idea to something that's very different that our partners expected when they started the project. They were thinking it was going to be sort of white tech, and it's actually a little paper strip. And so very different idea of what technology is about. You know, it's always about strengthening local care pathways, creating technology that reflects the context, and working with all communities to work collaboratively. So the conclusions are really service infrastructures are formed through particular historical, economic, social, and political conditions. Never think they're not. There is always embedded stories there and histories. It has a very, very long history, service. We can look at it in its many different forms. Service design is a relatively new phenomena, but it has now reached maturity, and we're at a point where we have to critique it quite heavily in terms of its role, what it's delivering for people, and who it's really serving as a field. And I think context and situatedness is critical. And really, it's all about trust and forming relationships as well. So that's it.
Do we have any questions? And you're going to have to speak into the microphone, so I'll run it over.
Oh, thank you, Alison. As usual, amazing presentation. So thank you very much for sharing that puzzle of putting pieces together. So you bring us a kind of very dark history of services, but also designers have a very dark history. We can argue that colony was made by design. So the combination is not it's not very optimistic, and the fact that we're still using the same tools with the hope that we produce something different is kind of naive if the tools in itself are neoliberal, extractionist, and so the thing is, how can we think differently? I have some ideas as well for my experience working in other contexts, and I'm being experienced this year a thought on design that has to be spiritual and political, and I'm trying to still be a designer. And it's very easy when you're starting to feel yourself as spiritual or political to stop being a designer. So I'm in that experimenting actually with my class. The students are here with those limits and those tensions. But what is your point of view?
So I think you're absolutely right. I don't think design history, I mean, again, I was looking back on when I first used to teach design history, and you know, it was very celebratory, whereas now, you know, there's a much more critical eye on what we're doing. And I think firstly you need to be experimental where that's possible. I think in our line of work, and you often have people from very scientific disciplines, so you have to get people on board. So in terms of how much experimentation you can get away with is always questionable. So you have to, I think every context is slightly different, but I think the idea that you go in with just a sort of toolkit is inappropriate. I don't think it's a way forward. For me, it's very much, firstly, the design ethnography. It's really understanding the context. It's about building the relationships with the partners who are on the ground, and time. And of course, that's not always possible. Time is really important. And being also allowed to find out together what your different perspectives are, because I say we because Jalena's sitting at the front and she's, you know, the research assistant. We worked on this together. I mean, we had lots of conversations about how to manage the expectations within the team, which were very scientific, very driven with, evidence. And we took them, had to keep saying that at this point there were loads of unknowns. It was the uncertainty. So I think you have to be experimental, but the degree in which you can experiment depends on, the situation in your team. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I would just say that, students should use the opportunity to find different ways, whether it's role play. I know there's a beautiful PhD from Monash where the student went to Indonesia and did some singing and performance because actually that was how the community communicated. So I think you have to be very open and adaptable and be responsive to what's on the ground.
Hi, thank you so much for the session. It was really good and insightful. You mentioned that it's not usually about the quick fixes and the solutions are not like quick fixes, but usually clients a lot of time or people you're working with would come in with a quick fix kind of a mindset. And then how do you tackle that, whether it is within your team or it is the person who's brought in the project? How do you kind of talk them into understanding that it's a much longer process?
So, this is really reflecting as a slightly different role that I've had. So Daniela and I did some work on case studies looking at service design's contribution to new service development and service innovation. And what we did identify is that service designers often will be approached to tackle a particular problem. And in the case, this was a project with NHS Scotland, and it became very apparent quite early on that actually what was being presented as the area for the focus was not going to be enough, and it was to do with mental health services. And in fact, the service designers worked on the project, but as they were working on it, they were showing more and more of the complexity. In this particular case, NHS Scotland sort of stopped the project. They actually sort of rethought it and then they came back. Now, the time for the consultancy, that may have been quite, that's perhaps not the ideal. However, they ended up with a better project at the end of it. I think, unfortunately, there are a lot of cases where people just drive to outputs because that's what they're expected to do. And I know with ex-students and, there is always a pressure that you have to deliver. And of course, on the academic research side, you have the privilege of time in one sense, rather than the commercial imperative. But I really do think increasingly people do, some of the consultancies that we looked at, where they realised that actually they weren't really addressing the framing of the problem was wrong. They did say that because there's no point in just producing something that's not going to really work. It's not really going to solve the problem for the client either. So, but I think it's a very good point. I think, yeah.
So just a follow up. So would you say that maybe having those slightly more immersive discussions where we point out more questions and more problem areas would probably help them understand that better?
I hear a lot of service designers saying it's a Trojan horse approach where you go in and then actually, I'm not sure if it's actually always a good reference, that, because then you open the door and the army comes out at night. However, but I think it's the idea that you go in with gifting something as one, but actually you're about to cause havoc. Maybe. But no, you're going to open up the discussion and give new possibilities. And in fact, in that first stage, part of your dialogue is changing the framing. And I think, I think a lot of service designers do get quite seasoned at doing that because often people don't quite know what their role is and what those relationships should be. So yes, I think don't be put off.
Thank you.
We could probably draw on even the student project that's just finished for those. I don't know how you felt about it, but I think you guys did a great job in terms of moving the client's thinking around what the problem was.
I think that was the feedback actually from the client.
Yeah. It's so it is a journey.
And lots of conversation.
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm.
Hi. So in public sector work, presumably sometimes if you're hired in one particular area to look at a specific problem or to implement a specific solution, from the work that I've done, it's normal to encounter a point where the jurisdiction of what particular department you're working for ends, and perhaps the roadblock or a major challenge actually lies between the touch points between multiple different departments. So in situations where you have like more complex jurisdiction, and you need all of them to work together, but different departments are quite siloed. I was wondering if you have any particular thoughts around that, not necessarily solutions, but maybe just some thoughts about your experiences around that.
Yeah, and I should probably then ask Delina to comment on that. But but I know when we worked for Camden Council on the social care project, this was 6 years ago, 7 years ago. There was a lot of talk. This phrase kept coming up, which was about budget shunt. And they didn't want budget from one department, even though we were trying to integrate services across departments to create a more seamless experience for the elderly. You would get somebody in another department, let's say leisure or something, going, we don't want budget shunt. We have our budget, we've got this amount of money, and actually we're not going to spare that to support this part of the project. So I think it is a problem. It may have changed, and that's why I was going to defer to you, Delina, because you're at Camden now, and I don't know if there is much more of a sort of seamless approach.
I'm also here with a couple of Camden colleagues as well,
sorry.
so we can.
So, and it is being recorded. So.
Okay. Maybe just to give you a bit of an example of something that happened today, which might help. There's a project that we're working on. There are quite a few different teams that are related to that project, and each one of them thought that they had their own sort of pretty good view of what was happening around the face-to-face experience of people coming in to the building, and just the idea of getting all of those groups of people together. I think at the time, everyone is so stretched for time, and everyone's so just like on their knees, and they're saying, well, we're doing BAU, but then we're also expected to do this and this and this and this. But actually, just by sharing a little bit of what the other team sort of was going through, and they were like, well, that's totally different from what we know. And that was sort of just a starter for a conversation for them to want to be involved and make sure that their team's views were heard. So it's just about, if as soon as you know one thing about a team or a particular angle, sharing it with someone else and someone else, and then you sort of get a sense that actually people do want to be involved, and you get a bit more of a jurisdiction from all people. Yeah.
I think that's a really good point, actually, because in fact this picture I showed of the different ways that co-design worked, we had some really good workshops internally, and that was because time was slightly on our side, but in fact it was that sharing of the information, and once actually you could see the possibilities, and also, people are pressurized and budgets are very short, so but then you can have those conversations. But we've I know from I think that's where the visual and when you do prototypes, it does make it also more real for people. It's not just somebody's word being brought into meetings or a slide presentation. So I think there are lots of the visual techniques that are used to support that. But I think it's always hard. It's difficult within any organisation.
Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you, Alison, for the talk. I want to ask about your opinion on human-centered design, right? So where I'm coming from is, in this example of the local authority, I think it's very useful if we say, well, you need to focus on the citizen, on the human.
Yeah.
then it doesn't make sense to, you know, be so siloed and all of that. So I do get that there is a logic. I do get that human is also a way of talking about outcomes and outcome driven. I do get that in the historical review that you've made, that's a logic that may replace the emphasis, you know, or takes the emphasis away from market or management and other logics. But I feel that every time that someone defines service design as a human-centered discipline, it's not really catching up with what we are doing now.
No.
So I wanted to give you the chance to talk more about non-human and other actors.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I was saying, I mean, within the work I do, which is on antimicrobial resistance, there is a phrase which is a One Health approach, and it is human, animal, and the environment. And in a way, you could look at take a One Health approach to any service design project in a way. Now, of course, then there's criticism also of this One Health approach because it tends to abstract the nature of the complexity of the problem. But when we're looking at a service design context, and it's more apparent in the global south because there is much more of an entanglement with environment and communities. But I think you are absolutely right. I mean, it's a living systems approach is another way that you might want to consider it. I mean, I was having a conversation with some academics last week, and we were talking about, you know, what's relationships between humans, nature, and or communities and nature, and these are really difficult concepts. So actually we're saying, you know, the emphasis should be on living systems and nurturing living systems, or, you know, a planetary One Health approach to what you're doing. But I mean, I'm sure there will be academics writing and defining this. But then you also have to think, when you use these phrases, what does this actually translate into? And I think that's the other challenge. So we have quite a segregated approach around health, but actually, if you have a system where you have clean air, clean water, and you have infrastructure that allows you to walk within communities or to move around communities in a way that is low carbon, actually you will have a very different type of it's not really about health, it's about just care and well-being. So where I'm going with my thinking is that, you know, there's a lot of a lot of problems become biomedical, but in fact they're just social. And, you know, if you're looking for the planetary health approach, you will get rid of a lot of what are called biomedical issues around asthma, respiratory problems, UTI, AMR, all these things. Actually, if you did take a more systemic approach to a context, you would probably have better health outcomes too.
Thanks. Kind of touching a little bit of what you have been mentioning in this last bit. There's like a lot of communication and a lot of things happening in academia related with terms and like how we are kind of defining stuff, no? So for example, all this idea of they're more than humans or posthumanism, and like kind of it creates a gap between what happens or how people or communities perceive things and how we define ourselves and our work, and not only as professionals but like also in academia. And one thing that I've been like thinking about lately is how can we kind of bridge that gap, or like how can we communicate better, and also because like most of this kind of social design is focused on the local, right? And like how can we make a strength, or like how can we foster the local elements, the diversity, and this kind of force that it's the one that creates community, but then you have these local clusters that work well, or like these examples or like things like that. But then you go outside and see what the industry is doing, and the industry is pushing globalization as like all the neoliberal agenda has been doing through the last like decades. So it's like in your experience, what do you think has been the most efficient way to kind of communicate these excellent efforts and like projects that have worked in the local way, so people kind of can start having these discussions?
I mean, I think there are more and more examples coming through. And in fact, there's a really nice Dutch example on social care, which is a community-based, and I'm not going to pronounce it because I haven't got the name on the tip of my tongue, but that's a really interesting model, which is breaking with conventional approaches to care in the community. I think there are other examples too. And in a way, the more we have those and the more they're made visible, I think it gives people confidence that they can try things differently. But I think it's a slow process because, and you know, I go back to the book Connected Capitalism. In a way, once the infrastructure is in place, it becomes more and more difficult to deviate from anything that isn't already imposed and embedded. So I think that's something that one, you know, again, where you get those good examples of community projects. And of course, this question of, you know, legitimacy for service design has very much been based around scalability. And so there's, you know, there's something that we need to question as well. What makes projects legitimate is actually how they serve the community. And maybe, again, Anna Singh has written about this issue of scalability. We need new terms, which maybe are more about an expansive approach, which is where you work with the community to introduce ideas of that system, but are responsive to the context rather than drop something in. So again, these are conversations which I'm, you know, will be, I think, more and more present in service design.
Thank you. Hi, thanks for the sharing. It's really insightful. And I really, really like the point you raised before about the build the trust around the community. And I think it's really, really important in a lot of service design projects, especially in the public sector. But we also know that it's such a challenging work to do, like build the trust, and especially when you introduce something new to different departments, and sometimes you're trying to change their daily ways of working. So just curious about, like, based on your experience and the projects before, like, do you have any experience about build the trust with them?
Adam Thorpe, who's a colleague at Central St. Martin's. I mean, one thing, he has built an amazing relationship in the community and with Camden, and in a way, that way of working, again, it's a long-term view, and that's not always possible. But I think really, even with our DOSA project, you know, when we started off, we were, even within the team, but with our community, we've built an understanding about what we're all trying to do. And I think that just makes it easier. And in fact, David Napier's paper on the building cultures of putting culture into healthcare is, in a way, that when you're trying for universal solutions the whole time, that people will be resistant. And in fact, in most instances, if they're listened to and understood, you're going to probably have a more effective outcome. But of course, there's an investment in that at the front end. So yeah, it's changing. I think it's really trying different ways of working as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was very insightful. I have two questions. I'm going to try to frame them well. Just a bit of background. I just graduated from biodesign, so it's all about non-humans, systems, working literally with living organisms. And I'm just starting a job in government doing service design. So my first question is around your experience with antimicrobial resistance and how much of the animal, the non-human animal perspective is in the project with the human center and co-creation, etc. And then also, how do you so I've just recently, this is the second question, I've just recently observed one of the initial projects that I'm going to work in. And one of the first things that I've been told is, oh, this is usually how we kickstart a project, is usually these tools. And I already was a bit disencouraged, because I was like, oh no, like I had already so many ideas for us to make it better. So what's your suggestions or advice on how to do that?
So in answer to your first question, I'm drawing on the work that I did with Trimithri as a postdoc on the DARPI project, which stood for Drivers of Antimicrobial Resistance in Poultry Supply Chains in India. And one of the things, again, that was very striking about that project was that there were lots of terms that were taken in as givens into the project. So biosecurity, this is a term that is very embedded in veterinary practice in the UK and in India, because of course the veterinary practice colleges are based on sort of European approaches of understanding animal health. But of course, when you go onto poultry farms, biosecurity, there isn't actually a word for it in the local languages often where the poultry farms are. So again, this expectation of, well, this is how you contain disease. And in fact, containing disease is a very difficult thing, especially also when people have very different relationships with animals and how they live in proximity. So when you go into poultry farms in the UK, they are you can't visit, ideally you don't visit more than one farm in a day because of contamination. You'll have disinfectant. Now you'll see some evidence of that when you go into a farm system, let's say in the global south, but there's much more crossing over. You'll have a cow wandering around, you'll have the dog moving around, you'll have rodents won't necessarily be seen as a pest, but in fact wild birds will be seen as disease carriers. So this whole different notion of actually, and this again goes to anthropology, about people's understanding of what disease is, it can be so different. So we when we went into the farm, we created a visual of actually what a farm, by what sort of an interpretation of bounded spaces look like, and the farmers actually use that to wander around and go, this is a place which wouldn't be safe, this place is. So it mediated the conversation, because talking about biosecurity is absolutely meaningless. So you do have to find ways, and in fact, a better example again with when I was working with Delina, we were tasked with going and finding out about UTI, and people were saying no UTI. So the symptoms were visualized, then went back into the community, and the Delina sat with the ashes and held up the visualization card, and all the women were yes, symptoms, they could visualize it. But then actually again we discovered it's called Tatrangi. It doesn't have this idea of UTI, which is a sort of term that has been translated. Tatrangi is a local Bengali word, and actually what it means is it relates to these symptoms that manifest themselves. So there's a whole, one goes in with projects, I think, especially if you're looking in sort of interfaces of human or living systems, and you have to be really open to interpretation on how you represent those relationships. And there's a lot of scientific language that is just, they're givens, and people, and you're working with academics who also see these words as givens, and then you go and, they have very different interpretations. But also, there's a lot more local innovation that is often not acknowledged in projects, and I think we saw this in shrimp farming and aquaculture, where you might get one farmer who's really experimental, but again, and how that knowledge is shared in the community, it's through networks. So again, understanding those collaborations that you might not see when you're visiting. So,
thank you, and apologies if I missed this in the first half. I think something that came across quite strongly in your work was how design is a political act. And I'm kind of curious to know, because you were designing in a very in and for a very different context. How did you kind of recognize and navigate your position of privilege, acknowledge your biases, and also your blind spots in your personal practice? Thank you.
So one of the things was, firstly, I mean, in terms of the relationship with the team, it was very much about us not going in. In fact, there were a number of both projects where questions were raised in terms of how one approached the topics. So we had very good researchers on the ground, but again, they were trained in microbiology. So there's different, when we're talking about different cultures, we're talking about all sorts of different cultures, not just in terms of geographical differences, but you're talking also about different types of knowledge cultures. So it was navigating all of that. So one of the things with the community was building this relationship with the Ashes and explaining the project, but they were very free to ask us. In terms of my own background, it's quite mixed. So it's less, but my education is very privileged, very mindful. Anthropology and being trained in that has made me very mindful of that. There were definitely times on the poultry project that I had concerns, and one of the things, I mean, that sort of was one of the reasons why we produced the tools, was actually what would we have liked to have known and thought about before we started these projects. And one thing I would question, I did question it at the time. I mean, it's, you know, who decides what gets researched in a way? Who decides the sites? But many of these things are done without of your control. Again, we were very careful that we were conscious of, again, the inclusion of the women in the village through the Ashes. Their stories have been really paramount, and Delina did amazing field work on that, credit to her. And it was actually, again, very relational for people, even like our chief shrimp farmer, who became to feel that he was equal in the project, to the point that, in fact, when it came to presenting at a policy, we invited him to come to the workshop and share his experiences of being a shrimp farmer. Now, those things don't always happen because you're with team members who are very, again, trained in a particular way. But I would say the team's approach has changed very much so. They are talking now much more about social justice. They're talking much more. So it's not just about the way it changes us. And I think you have to be open to the fact that you learn a lot from the people on the ground. But it is difficult. But the fact that we're having this conversation is probably in itself I think is not a bad thing. And I'd be happy if it hasn't happened, but there were times when there were cultural misunderstandings, but nothing ever for us to misunderstand and for them to misunderstand, I would say. But it takes time, and we have I think it's also about building phenomenal relationships with your team who are there and embedded and listening to what they're saying. They're the ones who know what the pulse is. So.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was a really fascinating talk. You talked a couple of times about technology, and you mentioned artificial intelligence as a way of speeding up processes and maybe interfacing with things. But we're increasingly hearing about, and I don't think we're quite there yet, but artificial intelligence is a technology that could have agency in the sense of making decisions and implementing those decisions as opposed to sort of static interface with some other system. I just wonder if you might say a little bit about how that might affect this kind of concept of service design that you've outlined here. Is an AI agent conceivably a participant in this system, or is this a technological tool? Or How do you see
I would say yes. And I mean, I don't know, are you referring to the way that it's actually designed in the first place, but also in terms of the outcome? I mean, already services are being determined by machine learning in the way that they're interacting and directing you in certain ways. So
yeah, I suppose I'm thinking about the example you gave was it can scan these containers very fast,
yeah,
and that kind of speeds up a thing that we would want a system to do,
yeah,
or there is a system to do, but it can do it very fast. But I'm wondering what happens when the system makes a decision as opposed to
yeah,
just doing something faster or
yeah.
being efficient.
So you mean it makes a decision in the case of not letting something through, or yeah, yeah, it raises many questions. I mean, I think the container, in a way, is, you know, is there's something almost just the scale of it is quite terrifying. But that, I think in healthcare it raises loads of questions, particularly because you could argue that the impact will be felt more directly immediately than a system like the container ports. But it's how one experiments around the interaction with that for service designers. And I'll be honest, I wouldn't know what that would look like at this moment. That's maybe your thing, Marley.
Yeah, I mean, this year was a report saying that already the AR services that serve something like, right now, serve something like 3.5% of the people around the globe, is already equaling the carbon print of the aviation services that serve like 60% of the and the AI services are modeling to explode this year and next. So how much is the carbon print of that?
Yeah.
So we have to think about what it's doing now rather than what it could be. I mean, it's again another extractivist model.
Absolutely.
So
yeah.
with the same extractivist tools, we can't ever solve the neoliberal consequences.
Yeah. Thank you. I think, yeah, that's a really valid point.
Thank you. It was a very, very insightful presentation. This is a very big question. So any examples from your work would be wonderful. How do you begin to evaluate the impact of service design interventions? It could be in any context.
Okay. I think there's what I'd call so in our UTI we're having a performance trial done this year, and so once we get the data back from that, if we get it through ethics, but once we've done that, we'll have a lot of performance trial data. We will know how effective that test is. We're doing in parallel, running a whole thing around knowledge, attitudes and practices changing, which is very much sort of more behavioral stuff. So we'll have the hard evidence of that in terms of how the different elements interacting with the community will change their understanding and ideally practices around UTI. That we have to produce in order to what I call the sort of more scientific evidence. So it will be 600 samples. We then have to actually implement the UTI test in a community, and actually that will take time, maybe, but I think within 2 years, maybe even a year, if you have, for example, the number of women, there would be certain indicators. The number of women going to the primary healthcare centre with a positive test, the data that would come through because we've created a very simple non-digital analog paper recording system for the ASHES. So we would have the number of books that they've interacted with, the community members who are testing positive, whether they've gone to the PHC, whether that They've left a urine sample there, which will then be sent to the medical school, who'll do a culture test. So actually within a year, you would get a lot of traction in terms of impact. On other service design projects, I think it can be a slow burn. In other words, you leave a project, and again, we've done this with case studies that we've looked at in terms of its contribution, and it goes back to that thing is the project didn't take off, but what is left behind is a possibility for a third sector or local government to think, we did this as a project 2 years ago, we're now ready to do something in terms of in the real. So I think, and that's often not captured within service design, and that's a real problem because, Lara, you've probably had experience of that.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to intervene. So I think that the main problem I've had with evaluation is the timeframes. So I want you to evaluate while you're a consultant, right? Or while the project is alive. It's like, well, I can't. That's one. KPIs are also wrong because you might not be doing what it says on paper that you were doing. There might be a misunderstanding within the organization of what the KPIs are. And then the other goes back to the methods. We're trying to capture a different type of impact, a different type of value that, for example, that might require ethnography. But I want a number. How many people, right? So if you will recall, Sylvia, it was the first year I was teaching here, and we did a project with Decathlon. It was to change or to incorporate design within the organization. And they wanted us to do one method, right? Like run meetings in a different way. So we went there, worked with them for 3 days or so, and we created this thing and left them to it. 2 months after, I go back, talk to the guy. He's like, Lara, I'm very sorry. We're not using what you did. It's like, it was, what's up? It's like, that's okay, but just tell me, what else? How's life? It's like, yeah, cool. Now I'm doing the meetings with sticky notes. And we don't speak forever. Now we take turns. And now blah, blah, blah. It's like, okay, so actually you've adopted.
Yeah.
Right? But if it was an email, it was a long coffee, walking around the office, seeing how the environment had changed. Often we don't allocate those resources, right, to evaluate.
Oh, completely. And that's, I think, the same commercially for people, that often... service designers, there's a lot of criticism by prominent people within Nesta saying, well, one of the problems with service design is, it's difficult, there's, issues on implementation and impact. But one of the things was the timeframes that they were given to look at actually how ideas were adopted. And I think, your point time, methods, and also often the indicators are slightly strong. I mean, even with our performance indicators for our UTI test, I've had lots of, it's been quite a long journey with the scientists I'm working with, that they have come around to the idea that co-design and collaborative ways of working in a team has sort of a value, because they want data, from surveys, from different statistics, to show them that something, they've got these views and knowledge, but in fact our processes are slow, and they're relational and they're dialogical, and they're saying, yeah, but why is this, we want you to tell us now. We want this evidence now. So you do have to change the mindsets as well within the teams of the people you're working with. So.
If there is one more question, we can take one more. There's someone who hasn't spoken. Oh, you've spoken before. You haven't.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. It's very inspired me. I'm the BA Design Manager student. And in community building, what can design do, and what does it bring to the masses? It's a frequently asked question. The key to community building is to create the medium, not the create activity itself. Community construction should be a high degree of interaction of space, activities, events, and social relation, and a new social sense, so as to stimulate community residents to spontaneously construct their own social organization and the social relationship. Among them, the role of design is more concerned with human development and improvement. What needs to be done is not specific design, but the design of an interactive mechanism and value that can maintain vitality. That is the design of how should community residents live together and how to make people fall in love with the community they live in. Therefore, in the era of the social media and the artificial intelligence development, I'm thinking about how to create a medium that suits the needs of the community, rather than let the medium become destructive or negative, contract to the original intention. So, do you have any? So.
I'm not sure if if I can answer that really. I mean, actually, it might be helpful if again from no, I'm not in a position to answer that, and also maybe and not to be. I think you raised some interesting points, but I think Marley, because I always think you're the AI person here. But so the question, in other words, you're saying, how can AI? It's not the medium itself, but actually, how can the content? Social media. But you mentioned AI at the beginning.
I'm more considered about the media.
Right. Maybe it's a conversation I have outside with you for a few minutes, and so I can better understand what you're asking. So I'm not sure if I'm understanding fully what the question is, and also which medium you're talking about, but because it's quite a big question. But we can have exchange some words outside. So I hope that's okay. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alison, for amazing talk. Before everyone leaves, we have a quick announcement from Lara. I do it. Give me the data. So the next talk will be run by Lara, and it's going to be on the 6th of March, same time. I don't remember if it's this lecture theater or another one, but within this building. And it will be about public design for climate action. A few confirmed speakers are Climate Kick, Connected Places Catapult, and Dr. Rachel Clark. And there's another few who we're waiting on confirmation on. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And we will share the recording of the lecture with the participants. Thank you.